Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm aware that this might be a bit of a curveball topic for some of you. And actually, when Wayne asked me to speak, I just have been doing a lot of my own personal investigation and research in this area. And so it felt like it was so top of mind. And I was wondering how I was possibly going to make it appropriate for this context. And then just serendipity struck. And when I investigated further, I found it was National Eating Disorders Awareness Week. So how about that? I mean, I was scheduled to speak on this before I knew that. So yeah, I hope that it's going to be of interest to you all. Usually when I speak here, I don't use a slideshow, but I have got one today simply because it's fairly content dense. And I hope that doesn't sound frightening to anyone, but I want to make sure that my facts are accurate and that this is a useful talk to you. So hopefully, I know this talk is going to be recorded. If this feels as though it's an interesting topic or pertinent topic for anyone you know or you love, I'm hoping it'll be a helpful one. So feel free to share the recording afterwards. I am now going to go and share my screen. All right, so we are talking today about a topic called It's Complicated. It's a talk for anyone who has ever wanted a better relationship with their body. So I need to start off just with a little bit of a disclaimer, simply because it is such a loaded topic. So first of all, this talk is for informational and educational purposes only. It's not therapy, it's not medical advice, it's not any other form of treatment. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I'm not an expert in treating eating disorders, but I have a special interest in eating disorders. And you'll hear now today that there's quite a differentiation between eating disorders and disordered eating. I'm going to cover both in this presentation, but I do see a number of clients in my practice who suffer from disordered eating. So if this presentation triggers any questions about any medical matter for you, please go to your doctor. I don't want to be held liable for any lifestyle choices or changes that you make that have any difficult consequences. This is information only. And then lastly, I'm very aware that eating disorders and disordered eating are invisible diseases. Very rarely can we tell from the outside what someone's dealing with. So if you are currently suffering from an eating disorder, or if you've ever suffered from an eating disorder, I really want to ask you to just be particularly cognizant of how you're finding this talk. If it's feeling in any way triggering, rather leave or turn down the volume, just to be really sensitive to the processes that are going on for you. And having said that, this talk is not intended to be revelatory or revolutionary for people who've got uncomplicated relationships with their bodies and with food. So there are people in this world who are totally happy with how they eat. They don't restrict, regulate, or monitor. They're happy with their bodies and they are at optimal health. If you are someone who has got medical concerns or food allergies, obviously those diets are prioritized. People who have low anxiety and a stable and positive mood may find parts of this talk a little bit irrelevant. And naturally, anyone who's suffering from deprivation due to food insecurity or poverty, this talk is not pertinent. That is not eating disorders. That is inequality and disadvantage. And anyone who's following a food plan designed by a treating medical professional, those people go and have breakfast rather. Unless, of course, you know someone who's suffering potentially from some of these categories. So I've just mentioned to you that it's National Eating Disorders Awareness Week, and I do wonder how noisy that is in South Africa. In America, there we have the Empire State Building lit up in blue and green, and they have over 100 buildings that are going to be lit up during the course of this week. Personally, I think that is something that could be foregrounded and for a little bit more attention to be paid, because I think you'll discover by the end of this talk, the number of people that this affects is far, far broader than we could imagine. So today I'm just going to go through these discussion points. First of all, looking at diet culture and why that's a real concern. I've got a very brief section dealing on eating disorders update, and that's really looking at some of the new research that's been released in the last 2 or 3 years that have really revolutionized the way eating disorders are conceptualized and understood and also treated. So that's just interesting. I'm going to talk about what's going on with disordered eating as opposed to eating disorders, and then hopefully try and point the way to a different way of being. And in doing that, I'm going to outline a few theories, the set point model, poodle science, and health at every size movement. I'm going to introduce these concepts fairly broadly. You can see it's quite a heavy sort of content-dense presentation, and I'm not possibly going to have time to dive deep, especially into those last three concepts. But I just want to give you a taste. And should you find that these ideas and theories and approaches resonate for you, then you can dive deep. There's so much material on the internet. So that is the eating behavior spectrum. Like all things, we exist on a continuum, and it's not as though there are very definitive parameters defining those different categories. So we have eating disorders on the far left. Eating disorders are those that meet the diagnostic criteria of anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and then the new categories that were added into the new DSM is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which I'm going to briefly discuss in the next slide or two, and then the eating disorders that aren't otherwise specified. So those are what are considered to be the pathology or the illness. And then moving up that continuum, we have disordered eating, where probably a lot of people sit without knowing. So let's just look at what that looks like. It's low self-worth or self-esteem based on body weight or shape, anxiety towards particular foods and food groups, feelings of guilt and failure around food and exercise, and a disturbed and unhealthy eating pattern that can, but doesn't have to include restrictive dieting, compulsive eating, and skipping meals. And you can see the overlap between disordered eating and eating disorders. Actually, you know, that progression can happen fairly easily. But likewise, we can also move towards the more healthy continuum of the eating behavior spectrum, which is towards intuitive eating. And intuitive eating is all about trusting your body wisdom to make choices around food that feel good in your body without judgment and without influence from diet culture. And the focus really is on nurturing your body rather than that biology of starvation, which is the restrict, binge, shame, self-hatred, restrict cycle, which I'm going to just briefly talk about a bit later. So why is diet culture a growing concern? Basically, it's just burgeoning. The idea that our worth is based on the way that our bodies present and the size that our bodies present in. And this has really resulted in the prevalence of eating disorders actually doubling. I mean, isn't that quite shocking? If there was any other pathology that doubled in such a short space of time, it would garner enormous investment and research and attention. So we're looking at 7.8% now of a prevalence of eating disorders. And in particular, there's a rise in midlife eating disorders. This figure was quite interesting to me. 13% of American women over 50 have eating disorder symptoms. I think that's really interesting. And I do believe that from all of this research that I've read, COVID has taken this to a new level. And of course, everyone's been joking about lockdown, sort of lockdown weight gain and sourdough bread and what it's done for us. But the research says that it's actually more concrete than that. That because so many people have lived with a stocked up pantry that tend to be often containing fear foods or trigger foods. And interestingly, the amount of time people are now seeing themselves on Zoom when you keep your camera on, and where there's body dissatisfaction, seeing your own image reflected back at you can be really uncomfortable and can feed quite negatively into catalyzing sort of a regression around that eating disorders continuum. So here are a few facts. Most people will experiment with about 126 fad diets over the course of their lifetime. If you think of how many years we live, that is quite a number of years where a fad diet is engaged in. And South Africa, in particular, is the 6th most diet-obsessed country in the world. Fortunately, most will not developing an eating disorder, and we're going to go a little bit into that in a moment, but many have disordered eating and moderate to extreme body dissatisfaction. And again, the stats say that moderate dieters are 5 times more likely to develop an eating disorder. But people who practice extreme food restriction, and this is my concern with some of the more popular diet plans at the moment, is that it's quite extreme. You know, food group elimination and extreme lengths of fasting. Those people are 18 times more likely to develop an eating disorder. So I thought this was quite an interesting a test to look at. This test, very aptly named the Eating Attitudes Test, was developed in 1982. And it was developed as a screening measure to help people determine whether or not they might have an eating disorder that needs professional attention. Now, the reason I'm putting these questions in, it's a 26-question test, is for you to consider how normal these questions have become in our age of fitness watchers, calorie checking, monitoring of intake versus burn, because these historically were used to measure eating disorder behavior. But take a look at that. These are just 10 of the items. They're on a Likert scale. I avoid eating when I'm hungry. I'm aware of the calorie content of foods I eat. I'm terrified about being overweight. I particularly avoid foods with a high carbohydrate content. I feel extremely guilty after eating. I avoid food with sugars in them. I think about burning up calories when I exercise. I eat diet foods. I give too much time and thought to food. I exercise for more than 60 minutes a day to lose or control my weight. I mean, if we did a poll, I would imagine that many people would say very often or all the time to quite a number of those items. Those are just 10 of the 26. But the idea is to kind of allow us to get a sense that diet culture has infiltrated our norms, and it's very much in the name of fitness and the pursuit of health that it's kind of crept in to make us consider what we eat and how we exercise in a really strange correlation that isn't necessarily connected to each other. And that feeds, of course, into disordered eating. So I want to just give a very brief update on changes in the DSM around eating disorders. 2 new eating disorders have been included in this category in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The first one is binge eating disorder. And the second one that I thought was of interest just to very briefly mention today is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID. Now, this disorder is specifically around people who avoid or restrict their food not with an agenda to lose weight, but because of dislike, because of sensory issues, because they just sort of have food preferences that become narrower and narrower and narrower until it's really such a small amount of food that is allowed to go in that it is classified as an eating disorder. But both binge eating disorder and ARFID don't have to have body image concerns as a key diagnostic criteria. That was a change in the latest DSM. And the other change is that there's no longer an upper limit put on BMI. I'm going to talk about BMI in the next slide, because the truth is most people with eating disorders, in fact, by far the majority of people with eating disorders, do not look like they've got an eating disorder. Just let that sink in for a moment. Our stereotypical idea of what an eating disorder looks like is not that. So we never know when we're talking to someone with an eating disorder. And very often it kind of goes under the radar, even in a medical clinical setting. So the BMI is problematic. And I mean, this makes so much sense if you think about it, because it doesn't take into account muscle mass. We all know muscle is heavier than fat. It doesn't take into account bone density, that good, strong, solid bones are going to be heavy. It doesn't take into account overall body composition, and it doesn't take into account gender differences. So basically, if you've got someone who is quite muscular and with really good, strong bones, they are going to have a higher BMI that some medical models would then classify in a, obese range. And it absolutely doesn't go near that in lived reality. So the BMI is a really, as my daughter would say, sus measurement, and one that we really need to think about. When we looked at that eating behavior spectrum, the question always is, what would take someone from that disordered eating place and tip them into the actual eating disorder category? And I want to say to you today that the research that's come out increasingly is that this is a biological, physiological, neurological, psychiatric, endocrinological, genetic etiology. In other words, it's not about wanting to be thin. The research that was published in 2019 have said that genetic factors account for 40 to 60% of someone's liability to developing anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorder. That's quite astonishing if you think of how eating disorders have been conceptualized traditionally. We also know, in terms of phenotypes, which are also sort of preset to a certain degree, that there are certain personality traits, and they all go around the obsessive compulsive personality trait spectrum, that lend themselves to moving towards an eating disorder. So self-orientated perfectionism is an important one. It's distinct from perfectionism, which can tend to impose very high standards on everyone and everything, including self. Self-orientated perfectionism is very forgiving of everyone else, but has unrelenting, rigorous standards that are imposed about self. And we all know perfectionism is simply a defense against anxiety, as is inflexibility a defense against anxiety, because I need to control my environment in order to soothe and calm this turbulence I'm feeling inside. Someone who's very rule-driven with a drive for order and symmetry, and it can be characterized by excessive doubt and cautiousness. So the genes plus the personality traits really is what genetic counselors would call the loaded gun. And then we have the environment or other biological factors that can pull the trigger. And I'm going to explain just now why some of these factors that might seem a bit peculiar to you actually do land up pulling the trigger. So first one is when someone who has that loaded gun is exposed to extreme anxiety. I'm calling it the churn and burn of dysregulation. When you're extremely anxious, you lose your appetite, you feel so churny in your stomach, and that can set up a cycle of food deprivation in someone with this genetic predisposition or proneness. A disruption to routine or environment, so the sense of, oh my goodness, I need to try and control something. Even a bad tummy flu or food poisoning, a new exercise routine, a fast, be it for religious reasons or, I don't know, there used to be that 8-hour famine that we used to do growing up, where as a fundraiser for people who had food deprivation, people would go on a fast, or the elimination of a food group. Basically, what that can do is that it can put those bodies into a starved state. And the next slide I'm going to tell you about is the negative energy balance, because what happens when someone with those proneness goes into a starved state is that the negative energy balance kicks in. Now, negative energy balance is essentially when the energy out is greater than the energy in. Traditionally, that's the amount of calories I consume is less than the amount of calories I'm expending. So I go into a negative energy balance. Now, for most people who don't have this proneness, they might go into a negative energy balance and it makes them hangry, it makes them irritated. Someone goes on a diet and they moan endlessly. And then the diet ends and they go back to normal eating and all is well. But for when someone with this particular genetic proneness goes into negative energy balance, what happens is the serotonin levels that are buzzing too high, and we know now that people with social anxiety in particular have very elevated serotonin levels. the negative energy balance actually brings that serotonin down. And so there's this incredible relief from anxiety. That relief from anxiety can be almost like an anxiolytic. This anxiety I live with all the time is actually soothed in this moment now that I'm in this negative energy balance and I feel safe. And that in itself can become addictive. It is quite an interesting phenomenon that it's progressive, because as the serotonin levels drop and the anxiolytic effect is experienced, the brain, because the body is designed to move towards homeostasis, starts pruning the serotonin receptors so that actually even the decreased serotonin is still too much for the serotonin receptors. And so anxiety goes up again, and then even more starving and even more calorie deficit is required in order to regain the anxiolytic effect. And so that way, starvation is actually progressive. And it's why anorexia has one of the highest fatality rates of any mental health diseases at all. Because ultimately, it will land up in death. That's just the way the neurobiology works, unless there's an intervention and treatment. So I hope that you get a sense from having heard like a real skate over of those facts, that eating disorders are not about being thin. Psychologists used to conceptualize the development of eating disorders as the fault of the family system and the invasive mother or the over-controlling father. This is not the fault or the choice of the patient. And most importantly, it has nothing to do with a vanity project. And I often think this must be the hardest thing for those suffering with an eating disorder, is that psychology, as you've heard it described just now, is usually quite undefined by vanity. So there's such an ego dystonic experience of going, everyone thinks I'm buying into this culture that's all about being thin and gorgeous, and actually I just want to wear baggy clothes and hide myself. This is not about me looking beautiful or trying to sort of amplify my attractiveness. It's actually a powerfully dangerous brain disease. And the way eating disorders have been conceptualized historically, quite frankly, it's guilt-inducing and shame-inducing and creating dangerous stories that really have informed treatment modalities and land up sabotaging recovery, which is why recovery from an eating disorder is slow, on average 6 to 10 years recovery, and often unsuccessful. And I do want to just say this, and it's in reference to the fact that I spoke about earlier, that 13% of women over 50 in America have an eating disorder. I really think that an enormous amount of people suffered from eating disorders that went undiagnosed or went below the radar in their teen years or early adult years, and were able to recalibrate and find a way to survive and to live. And there are a lot of new diets that are being introduced and a whole lot of new eating plans that talk about eliminating food groups and going on fasts. And again, if all has always been well with you, then that might be fine. But if you've had a history of an eating disorder, that's really, it's like saying to an alcoholic, it's fine, you can just have 1 glass of wine a night. It just doesn't work. So Jennifer Rowland is a activist in this area, and she's on Instagram. I think it's quite a good feed if you ever have teenagers or people who are very active on Instagram. It's quite good to put these kind of accounts on the feed just to be a corrective to diet culture. She says, if you are in recovery or have a history of an eating disorder, there's simply no way to eat clean. Quit sugar, avoid processed food, go on a diet, even if you call it a lifestyle change, and strongly maintain your recovery. It's paradoxical. It's like saying, let me heal from my mental illness that causes me to obsess and focus on my food, and my body, by finding a new way to obsess and focus on food and my body. So what's going on with disordered eating? And I'm just basically going to talk to the pyramid. We all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And my sense is that this is what goes on with disordered eating. We can see there that the very foundation of the pyramid is physiological needs, right? We need to have food, water, warmth, and rest in order for our safety needs and love needs and esteem needs and self-actualization needs to be met. But what happens when we go into food restriction is that we start teaching our body that it can't rely on a steady, consistent supply of food. And that whole sense of physiological safety is undermined. When we don't feel physiologically safe, our anxiety goes up because we don't feel safe or secure. And then we start distrusting the intimate relationships around us. Friendships become competitive. And I think we probably all know that comparison culture is what has fed so much into promotion of diet and body image dissatisfaction. When we're not feeling safe, when we're not feeling as though we belong and as though we are deeply and intimately connected to other people, we don't get our esteem needs met because we're feeling pretty crummy about ourselves. And more than that, we're being so preoccupied by maintaining this disordered eating pattern of restricting food and doing the compensatory exercise and landing up spending far too much mental energy and time on these biological functions, that achieving self-actualization is almost entirely out of the ballpark. There's just no time left for it, even if we were able to somehow squeeze our ways through the other layers when food security is not being met. So essentially, the restrict, binge, shame cycle does exactly that. People start getting a sense of dissatisfaction about their bodies. They think, oh, I can just trim this off, or so-and-so is looking better than me. They've just lost weight. They look so good. Let me restrict. There's a sense of brief relief because diets initially work, but of course then they're sabotaged because our bodies need food, so we get cravings. Then often there's a binge, and then there's guilt and shame, and then restriction again. And really, if there's anything I'd like you all to take home today from this talk, is that this idea of shame around our own bodies, the sense of self-consciousness and social comparison and competitive relating, it isolates us more than anything. There's such a profound sense of aloneness in our deepest places of shame. When we don't thrive in disconnectedness, it actually shuts us down. I'm not going to go too much into the whole decreased range and variety of food, except to say that as we limit food intake, basically it compromises our gut health. And when we have compromised gut health, symptoms like IBS, food intolerances, inflammation of the gut, autoimmune responses, and thyroid issues are actually sitting in the wings waiting to come and hijack our bodies, because the gut microbiota has been so well and extensively written about in terms of maintaining our health. We need that little complex system to keep all of these other maladies at bay. And then, of course, there's the idea of the increasingly loud inner critic, that self-hatred, and this is an interesting thing, I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but when people have a loud inner critic, it's almost always the second person. We don't have the sense of, oh, I'm disgusting. It usually comes in the words of, you're disgusting, you're a pig, you're revolting, no one's ever going to love you. My sense of that is that it's because we get dissociated from our bodies when we're not listening to its cues. We almost, our sense of self is positioned in a way that makes the body the enemy, and it others the body. And so this inner critic becomes on its high horse and starts disparaging and being disgusted by the body. And in fact, in active eating disorders, that inner critic very often becomes auditory hallucinations, quite literally, where that voice will be heard. That's the degree of dissociation that can happen. So our healing is towards integrating with our body again, listening to it, finding out ways to be attentive to cues and learning to trust what the body needs. And I mentioned in the last slide how much this restrict, binge, shame cycle diffuses our energy, attention, and resources, so that so many other things we could be doing in this world and in our life don't get done. I'm not going to talk about disordered eating and irritable bowel syndrome, but if you are interested in it, please go read up about it. There's such a high correlation, and it could provide quite a lot of reasoning around why so many people suffer from IBS. So let me talk about a different way. I'm doing okay time-wise. Here is the bad news for people who are addicted to dieting. Welcome the set point model. Roughly 90% of people who lose a lot of weight eventually regain just about all of it. Not initially, dieting is quite successful at first, but we all know that once you reduce your calorie intake, your body recalibrates, because our entire physiology is designed to move towards homeostasis. And people regain weight not because they are weak or that they have no willpower or that they just can't resist the chocolate cake. No, it's because there are powerful biological responses that says the body basically hijacks the mind and says, you are not going to starve me. I'm going to make sure I get the food that I need. And usually when people regain the weight, they actually regain weight and more, which is why dieting in itself can set in place this sort of progressive weight gain over the decades. And most people who start dieting end up dieting, as we saw, 126 different diets over the course of a lifetime. Basically, the set point model says that we have a genetically preset weight range that's controlled by biological signals. So, if you go to an endocrinologist and you want to find out how tall your children are going to be, obviously your children are going to all vary in height, but they're going to be within a range that is genetically preset. And it's the same thing with weight. We're going to have a range. And essentially that's not going to be able to be manipulated. And it's quite an interesting thought. If you think about how it was coming to terms with how tall you were going to be, I'm sure we all had that moment in teenage years. I remember thinking, oh, I'm going to be one of the tall ones. And at the time, I was not delighted about it. But you know what? Very quickly, I made my peace with it and accepted it. And very few of us go through life sort of resenting our bodies and begrudging the fact that we're a particular height. We just learn to accept it. And I just wonder why it's so very, very hard for us to accept the idea that the body shape and size we have is largely genetically preset. Having said that, because of the progressive dieting, very often bodies end up being larger than that set point range because of the starvation store cycle. So finding a different way of being can actually help you find your preset weight range that might be where your health is optimized, rather than trying to sort of manipulate your size through different interventions. So basically, our body is homeostatic. It has a regulatory system that keeps us at a steady state level or a set point. I just want to briefly mention this idea that I've got a big problem with this idea that healthy is the new skinny. Healthy is not the new skinny. That is healthist and ableist. The truth is that fitness words are often used to disguise fat phobia, and that most of us have got some kind of health impediment that we have to learn to live with, whether it's high cholesterol or diabetes or being disabled and not being able to exercise. We've all got our own parameters, and to idealize and deify the sense of being absolutely optimally fit and healthy is problematic. We need to find our way to be our best selves and the healthiest person we can be within the parameters of our own physiology. And that involves celebrating difference. So here is a little video I'm going to show you on poodle science. Poodle science is, it basically unpacks this idea, and it's part of one of the ideas motivated by the Health at Every Size movement, which I'll discuss briefly on the next slide. But it's a 2-minute video. I hope you enjoy it.
There's a big problem at the center of our research on weight and health. What's the problem? Well, picture a society made up of dogs. Let's say poodles are the bossiest group. They're the ones you see down at the doggy park barking at all the other dogs about how to live their lives in order to be healthy. But the problem is, Poodles think that every other kind of dog is just a really big, a really small, or a really fat poodle, when actually the other dogs aren't even poodles at all. They're terriers, or mastiffs, or greyhounds, or labs. And all of the thousands of different dog breeds have different lifespans and different health risks. Each one has evolved to use food differently for different specialties at surviving. Some for staying warm, some for running fast, and some for being strong. They're meant to be different sizes and weights. So the poodles think the mastiff should lose weight, but a starving mastiff never becomes a poodle. The poodles don't understand that dogs come in many more sizes than they can imagine in their poodle-centric ways. So this becomes a problem when it comes to poodle science. When the poodles did their weight and health research and made their claim that lighter dogs are healthier and live longer, they weren't comparing thinner poodles and fatter poodles. They were comparing poodles and mastiffs. So the recommendation for mastiffs to lose weight is based on the false assumption that if all dogs reach poodle weight, then all dogs will have poodle health. But once again, a starved mastiff just isn't a poodle. This poodle science doesn't even test whether a starved mastiff lives longer than a mastiff who has enough to eat, because one would have to compare mastiffs who maintain poodle weight to mastiffs that maintain mastiff weight. And it turns out that starving mastiffs regain weight, which after all is a much better thing than starving. But the poodles can only see that regain as a failure of mastiff self-discipline. Look, poodles are great, but poodle-centric health policy is a nightmare. Good science tells us that it's better to recognize and respect the ways we're different, because how we're treated, having good friends, having access to decent food, a place to play, restful sleep, and medical care make a huge difference in our health and longevity, for all of us, whatever our size.
All right, so the health at every size movement has actually garnered a fair bit of controversy, I think particularly in America, where there have been some medical health professionals that have criticized it and said there is real danger at people who are really on the very obese side of things embracing this idea of just pure body acceptance, and that their health is potentially endangered, and that becoming smaller is possibly healthy. And I'm not negating any of those arguments. I'm not going to go into the controversies around the health at every size movement. But the idea essentially is that body size is not an accurate indication of health. And, you can have someone who typically in the fitness culture would be considered to look really healthy and that perhaps present as really slim, and that they would possibly be the most unhealthy that they've ever been in their lives because they are nutritionally deficient, they're over-exercising, they've got all types and sorts of maladies based on some of the conditions I've indicated here. And someone else who is able to be intuitively eating what they need to, and that their body is just designed to be larger. And for healthcare professionals to discriminate around medical treatment and protocol based on a perception that health is equated to size is problematic. So if you're interested in exploring a little more about health at every size, bear the controversies in mind, but as always, embrace what's useful about it. And I think maybe non-diet culture is a less politically laden term than health at every size, but you get the essence of it. The principles of health at every size are weight inclusivity. So there's no discrimination on medical treatment and provision of medical treatment based on the size that someone is at. Health enhancement, the idea that we need to be the healthiest we can possibly be, whatever weight that lands up being. Respectful care, eating for well-being rather than eating to manipulate body shape, and life-enhancing movement rather than movement that's designed to burn calories. Essentially, with better self-care, our bodies are more likely to stabilize at their own natural, healthy weight. And, in therapy, one of the themes that just comes up over and over again is this idea of self-care, that people find it by and large, incredibly hard to look after themselves. So the punitive, restrictive approach of diet culture can be very easy for someone to swallow if they neglect self-care. And the suggestion would be rather embrace self-care. It sounds so cliched, but to love your body, or if you can't love it, at least have body neutrality, like, oh, I can work with this, you know. And we will stabilize it where we're supposed to be. I want to introduce you to a poem. Now, those of you who know me know that poetry is my love language. This poem was written by Derek Walcott, and it's about a relationship that's over, and it's about learning to love yourself after a relationship. But as you listen to it being read, I'd really like you to hear it through the lens of the relationship with your body. That perhaps the relationship with your own bodies has been problematic and damaging and hurtful. And learning to love yourself again is really part of this new way of being. The poem talks about taking down the pictures and the notes and peeling your image off the mirror. And it reminded me of how often weight loss programs will have suggestions like put a picture of the thin you on the fridge or write motivational notes. And all of that is just so engendering of guilt and shame and connecting you to feelings of failure, rather than learning to love yourself again. So just for a moment, close your eyes if you want to and hear this poem.
Love After Love by Derek Walcott. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life.
And that's just a beautiful quote. And I said to my body softly, I want to be your friend. It took a long breath and replied, I've been waiting my whole life for this. And that's that from me. I'm going to stop my screen sharing and hopefully see some of you.
Okay, so there is a few of the questions on the chat, well, a few comments, but the one was, I think it was tongue-in-cheek, but I wonder what your thoughts are about this, that Sean says it seems that Discovery Vitality may be closer to poodle science with a smiley face. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of those things, Amber. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
Oh, you know, I just don't want to get embroiled in any controversy.
Right.
Still
okay.
Recording. No, I do think that there is a slow and gradual shift towards embracing difference. And hopefully in every way. There's a lovely book that was written, and I've forgotten the name of the author, called The Body is Not an Apology. And it talks about bodies holding meaning in every way and how the interpretation of the body has been so politically laden. I have often thought that, you know, as equal opportunities emerged for women, so this idea of the idealized twiggy type skinny body also emerged, and it felt like a new form of suppression. And I'm not suggesting that only women suffer from disordered eating, but it is one of the greatest impediments to equality, is that if a whole group of people are preoccupied and obsessed with manipulating body shape through calorie deficit, which is going to be weakening and lowering of their functionality in every way, it's a new form of disempowerment, and one that women inadvertently participate in. And that's not answering the discovery question because I very deliberately dodged it.
I just want to ask a question about where do you get help? So the one thing that came to mind is that, you know, it's quite easy to go to a nutritionist, or, you know, so if you're struggling with eating and food, you might go to a nutritionist and fall right into the hands of poodles, if I can put it like that. So maybe you can make, some suggestions there.
Yeah, so first of all, for people who maybe have heard this talk and have recognized that perhaps they even fall into the eating disordered category, I would suggest to really seek out a treating team, a psychologist, a dietitian, and a supportive network that specialize specifically in eating disorders. Those that are more in the disordered eating category, or even people that do want to get into a healthier place with their body, there are a lot of dietitians that call themselves no diet dietitians or base themselves on the premise of intuitive eating. And I would suggest that that's a really good starting point.
Just a random thought that caught my mind and attention as you were talking about the emotional deficit section, and in particular serotonin levels. It made me wonder if there isn't some crossover, as you describe eating disorders and disordered eating, if there's not crossover with other addictive lifestyle patterns and behaviors where we are, you know, unwittingly maybe catering to those kinds of biological responses, physiological responses that satisfying of an addiction brings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that most psychologists would agree with that when we see addictive behaviors, it's all symptomatic of treating an underlying problem. And that underlying problem is often biologically based. It's very elevated anxiety. It's a very disrupted physiology. And it also goes the other way that, you know, a lot of the anxiety and depression I see here is because people are often in a semi-starved state, or because they're in such self-loathing around their body dissatisfaction that it's called anxiety and depression, but actually we're whole systems and everything's integrated. It's not a discrete division between psychology and spirituality and physiology. So I'd really agree with that, Fred.
There's so much sort of new movements, you know, the veganism is getting bigger and bigger, especially in privileged societies. You know, you don't get many vegans sitting in an area in places where there's less privilege. But you know, all the stuff what you talk, eliminating whole series of foods, no dairy, no gluten, no carbs, no sugar, and I sometimes wonder whether that's you know, sort of almost attention seeking, and I'm special, look at me, I can't eat. I mean, I'm sure there are people that are genuinely intolerant, and I think those must exist. But I just think a lot more people climb on these bandwagons of I can't eat dairy, or I can't eat sugar, or I can't eat gluten, almost to get attention. Maybe I'm being too harsh there, but you know, I've said to people, you can't eat potatoes now. I would say the whole Irish population should be sick. Or you can't eat dairy. You know, well, then what about all the Swiss and the Germans and the Dutch and everything? Why aren't they all in hospital? Or you can't eat coffee. Well, why isn't every Colombian in hospital? So we seem to suspend our brains on these things. But I'd like you to comment.
Yeah, it's an interesting correlation where we can certainly not say that all vegetarians or vegans have got eating disorders. There are many really legitimate reasons that people make that lifestyle choice, and particularly awareness of the environment, I think, has been quite a big momentum towards increasing people making those food choices. On the other hand, a disproportionately high percentage of people with eating disorders are vegetarian or vegan. So it's not bi-directional. When treating eating disorders, the idea would be to always look at when did the food restriction happen. very often it's at the same time. And when someone who's developing an eating disorder chooses to become vegetarian or vegan, it's quite probable or quite likely that that had a weight loss agenda attached to it. But the truth is that we are so deeply shamed about food choices and behavior that there isn't open conversation about it. So sometimes it's easier for someone to believe that they're gluten intolerant than it is to own the fact that they're wanting to eliminate carbohydrates, because it's shameful to be seen to want to manipulate your body shape. I also think that, and this is where we go a bit to the gut microbiome, the less you eat of something, the more difficulty you're going to have digesting it, because basically the bacteria and the enzymes in your digestive tract that digest the gluten are then diminished. And so you start feeling bloated and having a slight reaction to it. And then the story around gluten intolerance can accelerate. Not to say that there aren't people who genuinely are gluten intolerant, but I imagine that a far bigger percentage of those that believe that they can't eat gluten actually have their bodies have just forgotten how to, and that reintroducing it needs to be quite intentional.
Thanks, Anthony. Amber, I'm going to give you a few questions off the chat as well. There's a few that went right back. Nikki said, often it's the reaction of others to an aspect of our body that is so hard, the sense of rejection.
Yeah, you know, isn't that just the case that we judge because we judge ourselves, and the people that are judging us are judging themselves so much more harshly, and that is the truth. It might not look like it from outside, but the way our culture has evolved, and certainly with the sort of the norm of exhibitionism on social media, has created a sense of comparative thinking. And because we imagine ourselves in that sort of social hierarchy and a pecking order, there's so often the sense of, if I'm here and I'm feeling pretty bad about where I am, if I can pull someone down below me, I feel better. And you know what? That happens in all spheres of life, whether it's a fancy car or the body shape you inhabit. Our job is to attend to ourselves. And as we work towards body acceptance or even body neutrality, I'd love to say body positivity, we're going to find that those rejections are things that we need to work through and process, but not be wounded by, because it's actually about the other person's wound far more than our own.
One of the things that I've been feeling all the time is in the question, in the matter of following Christ and living for Christ, and Christ at the center of our life. One of the things that he does is to integrate the great things in Ephesians 1. The purpose of Christ was to bring into oneness everything in all creation. And one of the thing that applies here to my mind is me with my body. You mentioned intriguingly that I talk to my body. You're shameful. You're disgusting. You are this, as though I'm standing outside in judgment of my own body, and I think that psychologically, Christ integrates us psychologically, and let me, because I am loved by Christ and because I'm loved by my Heavenly Father. Yeah, I can be a unity within myself and not at war with myself. It's early in the morning. I haven't expressed that really coherently, but that's the kind of thinking that I think is really, really life-giving. Certainly, I think I found that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. I wanted to just very briefly respond to Delian, who spoke on the chat about a child with multiple food allergies. And Delian, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I just want to say that really is a bit of the, going back to my very first slide, when people have genuine food allergies, that needs to take priority. This talk does not pertain to that. So we all need to recognize our own limitations. And in the same way that a diabetic wouldn't go listen to this talk and go, oh, it means that I need to be able to eat sugar and embrace that. No, we need to work within the constraints of our own difficulties that we're dealing with in our bodies. So I can only imagine how hard it's for your child to maintain that elimination. It's so hard. But, you know, in every other way, that child can be supported to accept that too as part of the lived experience.
Oh, thanks, Amber. There are two questions I want to just quickly slip in, if that's okay, please. Sean had one right up with earlier that said, Sean had a whole lot of questions. Sean, sorry, I'm not going to get to all of yours, but I mean, it is a period of Lent for many Christians and many churches at the moment. And so what are your thoughts about, you know, whether it's Lent or, you know, somebody fasts for, you know, spiritual reasons and that, and how does that affect, you know, well, the whole range of what you've been speaking about?
Oh, Wayne, I'm so glad you raised it, because I can tell you now, I have known at least 2 or 3 young adults whose eating disorders originated from the practice of Lent in childhood, because there was that, where there was the overactive serotonin going on, and this child felt overwhelmed and over anxious, and then learning that restriction was possible was so empowering and gave a sense of control over the chaos and a sense of soothing in a world that was in every other way unmalleable. It can be problematic, and I wish that every, you know, and I think of the Muslims that fast, you know, and what that might do for people who've got eating disorders or potentially got that genetic proneness for eating disorders, that we need to be cognizant of these limitations, and really that there ought to be exclusions and for there to be permission for people to recuse themselves from those practices. I really like what Pope Francis has done with Lent this year, where he made it all about, rather than giving up chocolate, give up resentment, rather than giving up sweets, give up unforgiveness. And fasting is so much more than simply fasting food. There are many, many ways we can practice fasting in a very observant way that doesn't hold the same potential for damage.
Oh, that's
and I do want to also say that I think that we will never know, and we never know the inside of other people. We will never know if their motive to fast or observe certain practices in a spiritual way is driven by weight loss agenda or not. And quite often it's a mixture of a few motives.
Isn't that often the case, eh? Yes.
Yeah.
And then really this is going to be the last one, but it has been here for a while, from Victor. How does one rehabilitate self-image in a positive way? And if that wants to be your closing thought, or if there's another one. But
yeah, I do. I'd love to answer that, because it also addresses one of the other questions on the chat around what about overeating? Because anxiety and depression, as we know, can also go in the other direction. But I would suggest, and that's really often what's called binge eating. I would say that the whole range of disordered eating, from restriction to overconsumption, is really around dissociation from the body. And that instead of occupying ourselves with connection and with awareness, intentionality, and presence, we dissociate from ourselves and live sort of from the head up, just in our cognitions, and we become strangers with our own bodies. And the way of healing with this, I think, is, you know, in psychology we often talk about, again, a continuum, pathology being on this side, which is illness and disease, and integration being on the other side, which is health and wellness. So the idea with almost every path that we're going to pursue is a path towards integration of all of the wounded parts of ourselves, integration of the trauma experiences we've experienced, integration of the rejection, integration with our physiology. And that road to healing, I mean, how do we even begin with that? We need to have another talk. But I think a lot of it starts with making friends with our bodies and learning to put down idealized myths that actually hold no weight for us, note the pun, and start maybe just living more fully in the present moment.